All right, welcome to episode 7 for the Totum Realty podcast. And this one is brought to us by Old Soul, which is a bourbon that none of us have had before. It's actually from Jackson, Mississippi, courtesy of one of our clients. Mm-hmm. So we're actually experiencing it first here. Someone who's watched the podcast decided to come bring us a bottle and say, hey, why don't you try this on your next podcast? Wait, what were you going to say?
My initial thought is this is outstanding.
Yeah, we're starting with the bourbon review first because this is a fantastic bottle of bourbon.
Very good. Now, this is a 21% rye, 75% corn, and 4% malted barley. And it's a small batch, and it is tasty.
So somebody please send our props to Old Soul.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe my new favorite bourbon. I doubt we can buy it in PA.
I looked. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. But in any event, today we're going to talk about leverage and time, and I'm sure some current events along the way. But you want to dig us in?
Yeah.
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 That's impressive.
We're
ready to go.
Yeah.
All right.
Because this is what I started to say. We're going to have to cut and edit this.
No,
I just had a mini stroke, and I can't remember the name of the company.
Oh, my gosh.
I literally, as soon as we started, I was like,
K&L Gates.
oh, my God.
Yes.
I just couldn't think of anything other than Dickie McCamey. That was all I could think of.
Front line of the papers. K&L Gates.
Okay.
But not even
So
news.
are we ready?
Yeah, we're going.
No, I mean, we're going to have to edit that out.
No, it's live.
No.
Live and in color.
We're going to cut.
All right.
But yeah. So I don't know if you saw the news with K&L Gates.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so the topic that we're going to get into after this today is leverage and time, and how time can help with leverage or plays into leverage. So I thought it would be appropriate.
Or hurt. Can hurt.
Or hurt.
So I thought it would be appropriate. It wasn't like, it was a headline, not, top breaking news, but there was something in the Pittsburgh Business Times this past week saying that K&L Gates had acknowledged considering the Vision on 15th and the Strip as a new office location for them. So
well in advance of their lease.
Yeah, well in advance of their lease, which, that's that would be a large relocation, but thought that would be a good segue, because I think all of us kind of thought it was smart that K&L Gates was willing to comment on that and put that out to the world. So I think that is something that we can talk about with leverage, but then also digging into the timing aspect, because when I talk to people at events or, people who are asking questions about, the basics of real estate or leasing, and are considering, are getting ready to make those decisions, I don't think the general public has a great grasp on how long the process can take, and if you have an approaching deadline, when the optimal time to start your search is in order to maximize your leverage.
Sure.
That's what we're going to talk about today.
And before you started working for us, what did you think the answer to how far in advance of your lease expiring was that you should start searching for space?
Well, we all know I'm a great planner and super proactive, and that I definitely wouldn't procrastinate something like that. I had no clue. I had absolutely no clue. It's
so
not something
what do
that
people
anyone
answer when you talk to them at cocktail parties? What do they say?
Yeah, so I actually was talking to a young guy that's, he is one of the co-founders of a startup that came out of, I believe, Pitt. I could be wrong, could have been Duquesne, but a local university startup. They're in a co-working space right now, but growing, successful rounds of funding. So we were kind of asking him, do you think that you'll graduate to, I shouldn't say graduate, but do you think that you'll consider more permanent space soon and move out of the co-working situation? And he's like, yeah, probably soon. We're not there yet, but maybe at the end of the year. And it was just, if you weren't in this industry, that doesn't sound like
That's
a
7
silly
months.
answer. But being in this industry, you realize that it's very difficult to make anything happen, especially, I think we've done previous podcasts talking about supply chain and the delays in construction and the labor shortages and how that prolongs everything. But I think just in the search and the back and forth lease negotiations and time as it relates to leverage is something that would be beneficial knowledge to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the first things to be discussed is considering if you're a startup company, how big are you? Because the larger you are, the longer it takes. If you're a 2,000-foot office tenant and you're in a co-working space, yeah, you can do it in a shorter period of time. You can't
Take it
do
back.
it well.
But not
Take it back.
necessarily.
Don't
Yeah.
put that
Depends-
out into the world,
Yeah.
Michael.
I'm not putting it out into the world. I'm saying it could be done, but will it be done correctly? Is it going to reach its full maturation to see, am I looking at everything I should be looking? Am I asking all the questions I should be asking? And am I researching all the nuances of what I should be considering?
Well, back-
and also though the optics from the landlord's perspective, if you've got a tenant coming to you that needs to be in the space in 6 months,
Or 3 months or 2 months or 9 months.
you realize that they don't have the luxury of taking a lot more time to find the perfect space. So you sacrifice that in the negotiation.
I agree you sacrifice that in the negotiation, but establishing what are your goals up front. Are you just coming out of a co-working space to shrink down into a smaller space on a temporary basis, and it was going to be an as-is relocation? I'm not advocating creating a short period of time to do anything, because the gestation of going from one space to another is a long time.
We forgot to give Michael the disclaimer that this has to be short and sweet, and we can't pursue every rabbit hole today.
We're under a time clock today. But
So stick with the script.
But the reality is, back to the leverage, the point of leverage in a negotiation relative to real estate. In the startup example, in the co-working who's ready to move and move tomorrow, they do have leverage. That there are 2 periods of time where the tenant has considerable leverage as it relates to rate. And I'm specific to rate right now. If they are ready to move into a space in 60 days, guess what? They can say to the landlord, I'm ready to move in 60 days and start paying you rent. I want a great deal. And that is substantial leverage. The downside is you have to move into space in its current condition. So you have to be willing to take the space as is and be comfortable with it.
That is the point that I'm making. And I think in some of these situations for a small startup company, to commit to something for a longer particular period of time, or to say we have to wait to do this. Who knows for a small startup company what's going to happen while you're waiting space to be built out in 9 months.
But on the flip side, K&L Gates, not a startup,
Oh, okay.
large company, if they said to the landlord, if they only had 3 months left on their lease and were trying to pretend that they were going to be relocating,
They're screwed.
They're totally
screwed.
Totally.
At the mercy
And I
of
think the
it.
question becomes, with someone of that size, is I don't think 3 or 4 years is too early to be looking at something like that.
Which is when they
Because
started pre-pandemic. They started 4 years before their lease
4
expired.
years, absolutely. I mean, it's almost like if you were in a 5-year lease commitment, are you that kind of size tenant and that massive a tenant, you should be looking at it the minute that you entered into an obligation.
And
If you're that big, a 5-year deal for those guys is a short-term deal.
Right.
And it's interesting because it makes me think of the Dickie McCamey thing. So they have been in PPG for ever.
Decades.
Their lease is up in 2025, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and they just announced that they're moving to
Gateway.
4 Gateway,
Yeah.
was it? So I was having a discussion with one of my peers about it, and it's the point that this person I was talking to brought up is how, if you're PPG, how does that happen?
How do they lose them?
Yeah, I mean, how do you not make the concessions or say like, we will discount your rent or whatever? It's easier to keep them incentivize them to stay in a space than it is for a new landlord to win them over to incur the costs of moving. So,
Well,
do you think it's kind of uncommon? Like, what do you think led to the decision to incur those substantial costs to completely relocate and make that decision 3 years in advance of when it would actually happen.
I mean, I think that that's a rabbit hole. Speaking of rabbit holes, I think we should do a podcast just on that question, legitimately. And it's also really easy to play Monday morning quarterback. But the long and short of it is we don't have enough information in the room right now to answer what was so attractive about the Gateway proposal that said, you know what, all of the brain damage for the next 3 years is going to be worth it to Dickie McCamey because we weren't their advisor. But clearly, Gateway said to them, we're going to do X, Y, and Z for you in a way that they said, yeah, the brain damage and the cost is worth it. And clearly, PPG decided at some point, either A, they weren't going to reach any further, they had put their best foot forward and couldn't do anything else, or the decision was made in a vacuum, meaning that PPG was never going to keep them. There's definitely tenants who have just decided we are going to relocate because we want to change the scenery, and the current landlord might not be able to do anything about it. So.
And you're probably dealing with, a delta in a financial package that were at least an octave apart.
Yeah,
You know,
in the
it's-
sevens of figures.
Yeah, in an extremely large number that was a compelling reason to say, you know what, we're paying a lot of money here. You also have the dynamic of the way people work changed over that period of time.
Right.
So that could have
Especially
had an
the way
effect
they
into
worked.
it.
Right.
Absolutely. So I think that you have a lot of different inputs in there. But yeah, I'd say that that's probably a 50-50 thing. I would imagine it's so much easier to keep a tenant economically than it is to lose a tenant. But
If you're a tenant who wants new experience or new space, living through the recreation of your current footprint
Absolutely.
is a complete nightmare.
Nightmare.
So-
Nightmare.
Very difficult to win that one. But I'm curious, Paige, so you've been here for 2 years, right? So what questions do you have now answers to understand why, yes, there's leverage in the immediacy. I'm going to move into your building next month. Okay, we get it. Like that's almost like buying a car. I'll buy it today, cash, so give me a better deal. But what have you learned or what questions have you come up with to ask people now, knowing what you know, that make you realize that really the ideal time to be looking is probably in the 12 to 18 month range, maybe 24 months. If you're 200,000 feet, it is 4 years. But for the average tenant, the 20,000 square foot tenant, how long in advance should they be looking, and what do we know now that you didn't know when you stepped in the front door?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just the overall time that it takes to get anything done. First of all, I mean, especially with startups or companies that are transitioning to vastly different space. Like we're working with a client right now who owned their own building for 20 plus years and engaged us to sell that building and simultaneously engaged us to help them look for a scaled down, kind of like a touchdown office that was going to be a fraction of the size of the building that they were just leaving. And I think we quickly realized once we got all of the executive team from that, the local executive team from that organization together on a search, they didn't know what they wanted. All 6 people from that organization that came on the first round of tours had different ideas in their mind of what that space was going to be because they hadn't had to make that decision
Ever
since
before.
they had been with the
Right.
company. So for startups or for companies that are doing, if there's been new leadership since the last transition, or if COVID hit and has drastically impacted the way they work now, sometimes you have to go and see the spaces and get an idea for how they could work to really know and visualize how your company would operate in that space. So I think there's a learning portion of the process for the tenant that can take time.
Coupled with the fact they have day jobs
Right.
and finding the
And
time to
it's
go look
not-
at space, right?
Yeah, so I would say that there's definitely a learning period.
Which is usually how long do you think?
I don't know if you could say that across the board. I mean, couple
At
months.
least a month, but
Couple
maybe
months.
6 months, right?
Yeah, I would say a couple months. And even once you find the space that they love,
Or the building that they love.
Yeah, the building that they love. I mean, the back and forth on proposals before you even get to a lease is usually a couple months. A lease, you know, the lawyers can rack up as many hours reviewing the lease as you let them.
Right.
So, I mean, it's...
So we're at like 10 months and we haven't even talked about construction.
Yet.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, and a spoiler alert, I'm not doing 200,000 square foot deals right now. So the things I'm talking about are sub 20,000 square feet for the most part. And it's still taking the better part of a year when all is said and done. And even now, in the final stages of these discussions and negotiations and back and forth, our client has unfortunately lost some leverage because they have time frames where they need to get this stuff done within in order to get into the space or have the space be complete by the time they need to move in. So that's what I've learned. It's a process, and it's making me a more patient person because I was not that.
Well, I think your time deltas are pretty spot on, because you should really plan on just getting to the decision of this is the space that we are looking for. It's really helpful to have a minimum of 120 days. And then getting from
120 days for what?
120 days of just identifying these are the places I'm
The
considering.
buildings, right.
The buildings, not necessarily the initial tour, but a short list of these guys can work. And I think that you absolutely positively have to keep a competitive field of these all make sense, because you need additional information. And a lot of people don't necessarily, especially when you have a committee of 6 people, they have different perspectives of everything, and they don't necessarily have the vision to see what that space is going to look like from today to when they would actually take occupancy. Right. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a buffer time in there.
But you made a point that's really important to understand, is understanding what the options are and keeping a competitive set. Like, you cannot create leverage if you do not know what your next best alternative is.
Absolutely. And in certain markets where it's a little bit more dynamic and space is leasing quicker or space is not leasing quite as quick, you want to make sure that you have a backup. You know, you had a situation
that might
Dallas.
Disappear, right?
Yeah, that this is, okay, we've been going down the road because the landlord's doing the same thing. Who is going to lease my space? So I want someone to step in here, and who's going to pay me rent, who's the most credit qualified guy. And it's not necessarily the 2 people that he's dealing with day one. It might be the 3rd or 4th guy he's dealing with day 120. So there's always that threat of a new entrant that's coming in. So there is a momentum. And I think that's the word that you have to use to keep that leverage in your sales, is you need to keep that momentum going and keep pushing, saying it's always that back and forth of this is what I need. And as you're developing your programming, you might think that you originally thought you're going to spend $20 a foot for your build out. Well, now you realize it's $60 a foot. That dynamic's changed, and it changes even more constantly, because of now the volatility of inflation and then construction cost and time frames and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the time frame thing's wild. I mean, we're talking a little bit in a vacuum in the sense of, your traditional office tenant who's got time in a tenant-friendly market. I mean, my 20-year career almost exclusively has been in tenant-friendly world, right, where the tenant was in control. And I do think in order to create leverage, like we said, you got to be in that 12, 18, 24-month range. And we can talk a little bit about construction. I think we need to come back to it, not specific to the volatility in today's market, but just the time process for permitting and construction. But on the flip side, time, and Paige won't let me use a whiteboard in these podcasts, but there is a continuum of time. Would you make fun of me? Back to the Future today? Continuum of time or whatever
It's
I said?
Time, space,
It's the
continuum.
time space, which is we have a flux capacitor in the other room. Most brokerage firms or advisory firms do not have that. That's one of our secret sauce pieces.
But I encourage the whiteboard. Just let the record show.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get a little mini whiteboard next time. But the market also dictates what time makes sense, because in a couple markets that we're working in right now, we have clients who need space in Q1 2023. So that's 8 months from now. they literally can't understand what the market is 8 months from now because there's no space available. So they will be in a situation where they will be making a decision without any leverage. Because when space actually becomes available, they're going to have a choice of, do we wait the 8 months before we're ready to actually occupy the space, or are we going to take it and pay rent in both places for the better part, of half of a year? Because the landlord's going to say to them, if you don't move in, somebody else is going to move in. So the whole time concept, even though from a perfect world perspective, we'd love a lot of it, depending on what market you're in, you might not have it. And as soon as that is the case, you have no leverage. Like your leverage is completely shifted to the landlord's position.
But for one reason or another, you never have as much time as you think you do.
Correct.
Well, that's
That's the bottom line.
You've said a mouthful there. That's absolutely true. I don't care how long you've planned. If you have 2 years, you needed 2.5. Just because people think that if I have 2 years to make this decision, I can push this one off a month and this one off a month. The next thing you know, you're behind the curve. But, part of going through this process is maintaining that leverage. And even if it means introducing things that, or looking in other markets that aren't necessarily as volatile or as dynamic, you have to keep those options open to keep the leverage in your side.
And I would say, go ahead, sorry.
The landlord, it's his job to fill his buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're saying this obviously from a tenant perspective, but
Right.
if you were on the landlord side, you'd be doing exactly the same thing to translate that information to tenants to say, hey, look, we got other guys looking at this thing, and we're going to be able to make a deal here. And if this is the space that you want, it's not going to be around forever.
Right.
And I would say, too, the other thing I've learned is that it's easier to stall a process than it is to speed it up. So that's
Oy
my
vey.
pro tip of the day.
Yeah.
Pro tip
Really?
of the day, ring the bell.
Yeah.
As soon as you
that's
try
so
to
true.
speed it up, not only you're going to pay more, you've lost leverage. And
You've
showed
lost
your hand,
leverage.
yeah.
You're
Yeah.
showing your hand, and that it's that hitch in the giddy up that you've lost that momentum, and getting things restarted or slowed down. It all ends up. You want to have a nice smooth process for a nice clean transition.
Right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I love it.
Which also, that's the other thing I've learned in my 2 years is it's never a nice, smooth process. Almost never. So.
Well,
And that process, even when you get to the point, okay, now we have a deal done, now we have a lease signed, that leverage component never changes because you're going through the concept of building out space. So now you have the negotiation of the construction
Well, that
process.
should be done before the lease is signed.
But it never is.
never's not the right word, but
It's 95% never. That's the right word and the right combination. Construction changes constantly. Tenants change their mind, and they change their mind for reasons because they see things that they go, you know what, I was not correct when I thought about looking at it this way.
or I
This-
just didn't think about that.
This is a better way, or I didn't think about that. And so now you have the process of the modification of construction, which is a whole different dynamic. So you really want to keep, again, that momentum and having everyone move forward and being involved in getting those answers as soon as possible and identifying those. And that's the minutia that clogs up the drain when you're going through the entire planning process.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of examples just like that throughout the whole process. In the learning curve leading up to zeroing in on the space they want, in the negotiations back and forth on seemingly inconsequential things within the lease that can have very large consequences. It's not just as easy as having a lawyer read the document and being like, yeah, cool, sign it. There's so much back and forth. And figuring out when you can pull and when you can push in that is like, I have a term that I use for it. I won't say it here, but it's a game, and there's
It's an art.
Yeah, it's an art, and it's an art that you can't really rush without sacrificing the leverage. And then when you get into the construction and the build out and all of that minutia, there are a bajillion more things that can pop up. So
Time.
long story long.
Story long. This is going to be a long story short.
Well, I guess, but it takes time. Everything takes time.
Everything takes time, and if you're going to take anything from this, it takes longer than it used to. And, we haven't even touched on the other impacts on time, permitting,
Well, yeah, that's another
approvals,
topic for a different day
staffing,
when there's more
construction, but those all have elements of negotiating leverage, because when you do the initial transaction, what's the penalty of delivering this space?
Well, I mean, just keep it in the city of Pittsburgh very quickly and walk backwards, right? So permitting, once you have decided on where you're going, if there's construction that has to be done, you have got to get the architecture and engineering plans done. So that's a 3 to 4 month process. Most architects would tell you they want 5 months to do it. Then you have to go get it permitted. And in the city of Pittsburgh right now, you're at 4 months, best case, 6 months probably. So we're at a year, and we haven't even swung a hammer or put a nail in a wall yet.
Or bought a 2x4.
Right. So, I mean, I think that the takeaway is that if you're going to embark on a situation that is going to revolve around you getting exactly what you want, you need time. If you're comfortable moving into something that is previously built for somebody else, and all you're looking for is the opportunity for speed and price, well, then you've got a different journey ahead of you.
It's a different dynamic. We should identify those on the front end of this
Right.
these are the things that you're going to face. And so which path are you looking at? And you very well might do it on parallel paths and decide this is going to be the path of least resistance and this is the path of more resistance. You'll choose one way or the other based on what your decision is at that point.
And you need to have somebody in your corner who understands what's the market going to look like when that actually happens. Because if you choose the path of least resistance, I'm just going to wait. There'll be space available. Well, if the market's changing, there's no space available, then.
And no one should be giving you that advice.
Right. So
That is crazy. And that will change, okay, I'm going to do this in this respect. And sometimes it's the kicking the can down the road, which I hate that, as a solution, because it's not a solution. It's just delaying the inevitable. And let me add the other part is, let's face it, the world has changed. The way people worked from the early 2000s is different from the way they're going to work in the early 2020s. Space is different. Distance
just ask
between,
the guy at Airbnb. What did he say this week?
Yeah.
God, why would you bait him like that? I was waiting for Michael to just go into like a whole
No, but
dissertation.
what did he say? It was like anarchist to have office space or something?
He said it was anachronistic,
Anachronistic. Okay,
which
sure.
is from another time. And he's kind of accurate. The hybrid model or the model of work from home is, that's stuff that's going to happen. But what about the other things that there's a whole generation of kids that think that everybody's communicable, and you're gonna if the whole concept of
We're definitely going to stop this before it
of
goes
the
too
work.
far down the road.
No, the work farm, the cubicle farm is just never going to happen again, and it's probably never going to happen again. Just open
that's-
spaces, but it's a completely different form of construction, and you have all these spaces that don't fit that. So when you're looking at new spaces and repurposing them and repositioning them, you're going to have that same kind of construction thing, and you're going to have the same thing that companies going to have to consider, because that's what their employees are demanding.
And I think too, like, briefly, we touched on this yesterday when we were talking. I think there are certain companies that can maintain efficiency
Kind
and
sir?
operate
No, thanks.
remotely. There are certain companies that you need to be in person, you need to have the collaboration. But I do think what's applicable to this conversation in particular is, I think that the companies of today and tomorrow that will have office space, you can't have second generation office space that you've done nothing to and just move in. Your people are not going to want to come work in that. If you're going to bring your people back to the office, they want an amenitized, top
Flight
of
to
the
quality.
line,
Yeah.
something that draws them to want to come to the office. So the instances of the company saying, we need 15,000 square feet, we'll move in 60 days, take us whatever, give us whatever you have, those are going to be the companies that struggle to get their people to come into work. It's going to be an amenity war, the likes of which we've probably never seen. If I had a crystal ball and was going to say what I thought the next 3 years would look like.
Right.
But I think, like, you can't just be, like, shooting. If you're an employer and you have 100 people and you're figuring out how to retain your talent and get people back in the office and keep them engaged and build a company culture,
PNC says
your
re-recruit,
space,
right?
your space is going to be the cornerstone of that happening. And you need to start planning that immediately.
Today.
Immediately.
Right. I think that's a good mic drop.
Peace.
Love it. This has been good. Time is a critical piece of the real estate discussion, which nobody talks about, as we always kid. They talk about rent at cocktail parties, but they don't talk about time. So.
And there's never enough time. So when is the appropriate time to review your lease, or can start considering when you should be looking at what are my options?
Yesterday.
It's always.
Time is not on your side.
Time is never on your side with this. It's literally.
Isn't there a song that says "Time is on your side"? What is it?
Rolling Stones.
Something on your side.
Yes,
Is that a
time.
thing? Okay.
Time is on my side. Yes.
Yes, it is. But
Well,
it's not.
yes,
that
it
was
is.
a lie.
Yes, it is. That's actually the lyric to the song.
Time is not on our side right now, so we've got to wrap.
We digress.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to say thanks again to our client who I wish I could
Yeah.
say their name, but I forgot to ask for permission, and I feel uncomfortable putting them on the spot. But
But yeah, cheers. This is great. I really
cheers
appreciate
to
it.
you guys for bringing us this beautiful bottle of bourbon. We loved it. Next time you're in Mississippi, please get us another round. And
from the good folks at the Old Soul Distillery, that's a pretty damn good bottle of bourbon.
From the
Well, it's actually a different
that's
name.
a wrap.
Michael didn't eat today. He's been in the car all day.
I happen